Hi, I'm Rob Johnstone, and I just completed building this table. And I have to say that the process took me way outside my comfort zone. I had to learn how to do things like pouring epoxy, and I worked on some fancy, unique finishes, and it all started with an interesting piece of lumber. In order to fit it properly on the base, I'm going to need to cut this board up and then re-glue it to create a wider tabletop. I have to say that it took a bit of noodling to try to figure out how to go about that successfully. To get this project started, I'll need to break this lumber down into two pieces that I can flatten before further sectioning and re-gluing. This piece is curved along its length, and it's much easier to do that in shorter sections than in one long piece. Flattening big stock like this works best if you approach it a step at a time. I take the high spots down with a hand plane or a belt sander. This gives me a mostly flat surface to run under a wide belt sander, and it saves a lot of time and wear and tear on the wide sanding belts. If you don't have a wide belt sander available to you, then flattening across the grain with an 07 hand plane is your best option. Now that these pieces have been flattened and sanded smooth, I'm going to slice two matching edges in order to join them together to create one wide tabletop. By using a track saw on this track, I'm trying to rip perfectly straight cuts at exactly 90 degrees from the top surface. I want to avoid running these big pieces over the jointer if I can. Wow, this looks pretty darn good, but I do think it'd be smart for me to run them across the jointer. With this long joint now properly fitted, after running it over the jointer, I have to figure out a way to glue these two big pieces together. And I don't want to crush these live edges with a clamp. So I'm going to install some temporary clamping cauls. I'm using liquid hide glue to secure these cauls in place. Later, I'll remove them and remove the glue residue with hot water and sanding. I'm also using loose tendons to help me accurately align the two large pieces. You could use dowels or biscuits, but the goal is the same, an aid to aligning the pieces during glue up. Now with the glue up successfully completed, I'm going to remove the clamps, and then I'm going to remove these glue blocks, and I do that with a chisel, and I just break them loose. After I remove the remnants of the hide glue with hot water and a scratchy pad, it's time to get down to some basic woodworking, which includes sanding, of course, right up to 220 grit, and squaring up the end of the table with a track saw. I also detailed the exposed live edge of the tabletop, and using the same power carver, I shaped the end of the table so the terminal edges match. Next up was applying some Old Masters wiping stain. I chose mahogany, flooding it on and wiping it off. And when that dries, a coat of sanding sealer. Now I need to seal and harden the punky wood fibers in the pond area. I'm doing that with MAS penetrating epoxy, which is designed just for that task. I brush it on to the fibrous area and let it harden. I'm just about ready to pour my first layer of epoxy resin, but I want to describe my preparations before I do that. In addition to using the penetrating epoxy from MAS to seal the cracks and harden the punky wood, I put a thick coat of wax on top of this melamine to ensure that the epoxy won't stick to it. I also put a couple of rings of this silicone on the back of the tabletop to keep the resin from escaping the pond. Then I clamped the tabletop to the melamine work surface. And finally, I built up a dam of clay on this low area. I got it at a hobby shop to allow me to pour to the top of the opening. And, of course, I leveled the tabletop so the resin would be even to the edges of the opening when it cured. I'm using MAS Deep Pour Epoxy for this tabletop, and it's designed exactly for this sort of task, where you want to fill up a deep opening and pour a lot of epoxy, but you don't want to have to do it in a bunch of thin layers. Like all resins, this one requires an agent to start the chemical reaction, and it's important to be accurate with the ratio. I'm adding a bit of color to the resin to help create a visual depth in the pond, and now I mix it by hand for at least 5 minutes. Here we are at the point of no return. We will soon see if my preparations are sufficient. Pour the resin slowly. It helps keep air bubbles to a minimum, although this deep pour MAS product is designed to cure extra slowly to allow air bubbles to escape. That's it. Now we wait at least 8 hours. So here we are about 24 hours later, and my epoxy pond has been reduced to a puddle. Now, some of the leakage came immediately when we poured it, and I noticed that there was some resin flowing out underneath the tabletop. As you can see, we needed to add clay as a dam around one end of the piece. Did the resin leak out in other areas that I can't see now? Very possibly. I'm also sure that the resin seeped into the surrounding voids and open fibers of the punky wood. Even though I brushed on a coat of penetrating resin in advance, there was no way I could seal all the openings. It's time to add the next layer of resin. I hope to keep this effort to 3 pours, but that might be wishful thinking. So I was right. It took 3 pours in order to fill this pond completely full with resin. And now I'm going to move on to getting rid of these clamps, taking the clay dam off, and then preparing the rest of the surface to complete the finishing process. With the epoxy successfully poured now, I'm going to move on to the final finishing touches for the tabletop. I'm going to be using a technique called glazing, where I add color and drama to the tabletop, and hopefully I'll be able to hide a disconcerting flaw in my original stain efforts. Here we use the same stain, Old Masters Mahogany, that I used earlier, but I'm using it after I have applied the sanding sealer and another coat of clear finish. The idea is to apply the stain and feather it in to add color exactly where you want it, but not where you don't. Here, I'm hiding the sharp color difference that occurred at my glue joint. Then I will add color and tone in such a way that I hope will enhance the overall look of this unique tabletop. Now I'm just going to let this dry. I may come back and touch it up a bit. I can see where I might want to do that. And then as soon as it is dry, I'm going to apply my final coats of wipe-on polyurethane, and the finish will be done. So that's it. I just finished wiping on the last coat of polyurethane. When that's dry, I'm going to attach the base with some screws driven up from below, and the job will be done. I hope you enjoyed the video. Maybe you even learned a couple of things. I'm Rob Johnstone from Woodworker's Journal. Keep on making sawdust.